My guest in the Nimataion today is Dr. Justin Sledge, and together we are spinning a yarn. Justin, you're an academic who specializes in the history of Western esotericism, and of course, you have the YouTube channel Esoterica, which is just a wonderful source of information, well researched, of course, great scholarship, and I'm honored to have you here.
I really appreciate you having me on. It's a great project. What a fascinating conceit. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, what has been your favorite childhood story?
I think my favorite childhood stories largely oriented around finding buried treasure. I
Hmm?
was really one of my favorite movies growing up was The Goonies. I
Oh,
love watching The Goonies with these kids sort of go on this wild adventure to find pirate treasure. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, into a pretty poor family, a working class family, working poor family. And my uncle used to always tell us stories about how pirates from New Orleans, which is not very far from where I grew up, only a few hours, how pirates from New Orleans had secretly sailed their ships up the Big Black River and up the Mississippi River to hide their treasure all throughout various parts of Mississippi. I don't think there's no truth to any of that. Um, and stories like the story of Oak Island, where allegedly there is a treasure shaft buried on this island in Nova Scotia. And these kinds of stories just really fired my imagination. So I used to read a lot of these pirate stories and ghost stories, and the ghost stories and the pirate stories are almost always kind of connected. That the treasure was somehow cursed, and there were ghosts haunting it, and so this combination of treasure hunting, ghosts, and of course I also was a Dungeons and Dragons player. So yeah, these stories that my uncle told me growing up were just they were the kind of thing that really inspired me and kind of scared me, And I also grew up near the section of South Jackson called Choctaw Village. This was the remains of an old indigenous village that was in the area before the entire area was developed. And there, along some of the creeks and the banks and the forest, not far from where I lived, you could still find arrowheads and the remains of the indigenous people who lived there and who had been displaced. And as a kid, when you find a Native American artifact or find some old random piece of junk in the woods, who knows what it was from, you have to. My imagination was like, oh wow, there could be treasure here buried. But of course, with that came the real threat that the treasure could be haunted, it could be guarded by malevolent spirits, and this all again you get the feedback loop of scary stories your uncle told you, ghost stories, Oak Island on in Centro with Leonard Nimoy, and then you play Dungeons and Dragons with your friends, and you're the dungeon master, so you include, you play what you know, right?
yes.
So there's buried treasure, uh, you know, haunted buried treasure. And of course, what was great as I grew into adulthood and became very interested in Western esotericism and the history of magic was just that I kept finding stories about buried treasure in necromancers' manuals and Solomonic magic. The Enochian spirit diaries are just peppered with stories of John Dee and Edward Kelly asking the angels about buried treasure. And so, one of the funny through lines from my very earliest childhood all the way until now, when I'm picking up a medieval grimoire to make an episode of Esoterica about, is I have become haunted by the ever present legend of buried treasure somewhere in these books and in my memory as a child. Yeah, so I would definitely say that stories of sort of haunted buried treasure
Mm.
were my favorite stories, and stories that still have an impact on me literally down to where I make esoteric episodes today. There's not a chance, you can believe me, that if there is a buried treasure mentioned in a medieval grimoire, you best believe if I'm going to go pluck out an example of a medieval spell, or a demon that can find you something, and the demon can find you buried treasure, you can best believe that that's what I'm going to pluck out.
Yeah. And of course, these old works of magic, they are like buried treasures themselves, and they could be seen as haunted. So
Oh, right. Yeah. All books of magic are also magical books.
Yes.
So absolutely. So yeah, and also a rare book collector. I collect antiquarian esoteric books. I have, just right here. This is a copy of the Summa Perfectionis by Sudo Geber, one of the most important alchemical texts. This is a text from 1697. And so yeah, these books, as they sit around me, they also have their own kind of uh, ruach, we would say in Hebrew, their own kind of spirit.
Yeah.
And that ruach is, I'm not the first person to touch that book, and who knows whose hands it's passed through. And so they are also kind of haunted treasures, and I feel very blessed to have, whether literal or metaphorical, I don't know, but the spirits of all the people who've tried to unlock these histories, sitting somewhere in this room with me is also kind of yeah, there's something wonderful about that as well.
Mm. So this is kind of like in in practical magic, what you would call ancestor work, to connect through the ancestors of the art, through these objects, and also be a bridge for future researchers. Um, wh- what especially made buried treasure these point of interest for you? What do you think? Why were you so electrified by these stories?
I think in a practical way, we were pretty poor, and so the idea of finding buried treasure and not
Mm,
being poor anymore was a pretty attractive thing. You could escape the poor neighborhood, and we were the kind of family that had to figure out which bill we were going to pay that month. We could have either hot water or we could have electricity. Sometimes we couldn't have both,
mm,
and so just the thought of you know digging down in the woods somewhere and cracking open a chest full of gold and emeralds and rubies. It was a ticket out of a life that was not it was a poor life. Although I will say I had a very happy childhood. Again, those days trouncing around the forest were fantastic. So in a practical way, it was a ticket out of poverty at some level. Um, I think the other thing about it that was very alluring was again the sort of the idea of treasure is very beautiful. Gold goes untarnished. My first esoteric love was the study of alchemy. I still remember as a middle schooler printing out books from Adam McLean's website, looking at these old alchemical texts and trying to sort them out. Even when I was in high school learning Latin, I let my teacher let me translate an alchemical text as a final exam. And so the world of gold and silver and transmutation was also a big part of my thought house for a long time. So I think that there's something interesting about buried treasure was that on the one hand it's very alluring. Of course, you want to find it, but almost always in these tales and even in this literature, it's cursed or there's some strings attached,
mm.
and so you kind of don't want to find it. And this is also always true, I think, of anything holy. Rudolf Otto famously referred to the sense of the holy as both compelling and also repulsive.
The
And so
numinous.
I think that yeah, the numinous has this power of being the tremendum et fascinans. And
Yes.
so it was fascinans, and who doesn't want to go through the forest and find a treasure buried in some old stump, but also it's tremendum. It's my God, what have you found? Maybe it's cursed, or maybe it's protected by a spirit or a demon or something like this. So I think that it was always that the dual compulsion, the compulsion repulsion mechanism. And again, it fed back into lots of stories I had heard and movies I had watched and Dungeons and Dragons I had played. So it all becomes a kind of one thought world, one kind of gestalt, where as a child, as a young person, you get to live in kind of a I don't know an imaginary fairy tale world where you maybe find this kind of thing, and it has real world implications that you get to you get to live a life or leave a life of relative poverty and go somewhere else. I don't know where that somewhere else ever was, but maybe I'm living in it now. Actually, I would say very much I live a very good life now. So I think those kinds of things, as a child a child student of Rudolf Otto, that it had this kind of power,
Mm.
this kind of power on me.
So, in a way, one could say you found your treasures, and Yeah.
No, absolutely. I to this day, I'm an amateur collector of medieval coins, and I have a couple of silver denarii over there, and I have a gold coin of Justinian, and so I don't know that it's never the treasure in a box, but yeah, there is something about as a teaching tool being able to put in my student's hand a tetradrachma of Athena and say this was minted during the life of Socrates, or put in my hand a, uh, a, a, a silver coin minted by Alfonso the Wise, and know and look down on it, know this was minted when the Zohar was being written. And there's something about that materiality that this coin is not just a plug of silver. It carries a story and a history, and it carries a kind of weight. And I think all of that, for me, capture a little bit of that childhood sense of the magic of finding treasure in a much more rich way as an adult than I think I could have appreciated as a child. So yes, you're very much right that I found my treasure, but I think hopefully also I've earned a little bit of that
Mm.
treasure too.
Yeah. And I think as one should do when finding the treasure is not keeping it for oneself, at least not all of it, and just give it, give some of it to the world, and that you do.
Yeah,
So
I hope so. Yeah, I think that there are cultures for which wealth is shown not by what you have, but by what you give away.
yes.
And I love the idea that wealth is measured by what we give away. And insofar as I've been blessed to have learned the things that I've learned, and I have been blessed to have the opportunities to learn what I've learned, I hope that my wealth is always measured by what I make accessible and what I give away.
Mm. And today you gave us your stories that formed to a great part the person you are today. So that has been touching and a great pleasure. Thank you, Justin, for sharing this with us.
Absolutely, thank you, and thank you for giving me the chance to meditate on what are many wonderful memories from my childhood, and also things that still that I can still dip into today and find inspiration. So thank you for giving me the opportunity that meditation.
Thank you. It has been an honor. I look forward to talk with you again and have a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you. The world is magical.